was preparing, in 45 minutes you can only do so much. So what I wanted to do, what my hope is to accomplish today is to tell you about sleep and focus a little bit on older age and what happens with sleep across the lifespan and what aging does to different aspects of the regulation of sleep. And not so much telling you exactly what you need to do. When Nora said that she came home sleeping better, it's not because I told her what to do. I gave her information and she translated it into what she needs to do. So I hope that you all can do the same thing. So when you think about very old people sleeping during the day, they find themselves later on being wide awake at night. But because they're wide awake at night, they sleep during the day. So you get a cycle. And it's an understandable cycle. So let's see what we can learn about sleep and what's happening here. So I'm going to talk about the normal sleep across the lifespan, how it looks like. When do you think a poor sleep is really a problem that you should treat? What insomnia is and how sleep is regulated, so that you think about insomnia and regulation of sleep and understand what's happening with you. And I'm going to briefly describe to you a cognitive behaviour therapy for insomnia, which is an empirically validated psychotherapy that's a sleep therapy essentially. And I tell you a little bit what it is. It's biobehavioral. It's based a lot about the regulation of sleep and a lot about what we know about how to help people change their behaviors. And I'll give you a few tips and how you can get help, at least in this area. So, contrary to what people normally think, sleep is not a unified state. So roughly speaking, there are two states of sleep, or two phases of sleep. One is called REM sleep and the other is called non-REM sleep. REM sleep is when dream sleep is happening, when dreaming occurs, or most of our dreaming occurs. Non-REM sleep is the other kind of sleep. Now, non-REM sleep is subsequently divided into 3 stages, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Actually, 1, 2, and 3. I have a PhD in math, believe it or not. But the reason I had that sleep is because we used to divide it into 4 stages, and now we're dividing it into 3 stages. So there's actually a reason why I made this kind of unconscious error. So the way to think about it is stages 1, 2, and 3 are differing from each other by the depth of the sleep. So how do we measure the depth of the sleep? We measure it by how much noise it takes to wake you up from it, and how likely are you if I woke you up from that kind of sleep and I ask you were you sleeping, and you will answer yes. So stage 1 sleep is very light in the sense that 50% of people, if you wake them up from that stage of sleep, will say, I wasn't asleep. Okay? Stage 2 sleep, you're getting now to 85 to 95% of people saying that they were asleep. And stage 3, or we also call it slow wave sleep, because if you look at the waves here of the brain waves, they are much slower. This is much faster when we are awake. And we have some slowing in here, and you have much more slowing in here. This is the deepest stage of sleep. So you're sitting here and you say, that's what I want, right? Okay. So what I want to show you is the organization of sleep across across the night. And so if you think about, these are the hours of sleep, 1 hour, 2 hours to 7 hours. There's not clock time, but number of hours. So as we fall asleep, we're laying in bed, you're going to bed, you are awake, you fall asleep, you bypass REM, you fall asleep into non-REM sleep. You don't start sleeping into REM sleep. You don't start by dreaming. It's a disorder if you fall asleep into dreaming. And you get into stage 1, stage 2, and then you have a little REM episode. This is what we call a sleep cycle. It takes approximately 90 minutes plus minus 30 minutes on average. The first time it actually takes less time than 90 minutes. And then you cycle between REM and non-REM phases of sleep until you wake up. Now, this is a typical pattern of a young adult who sleeps very, 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 very soundly. Almost nobody, even the best sleepers, look like that. This is just a schema, right? It's not a real output from somebody's sleep. And you notice in it two things. You notice that the REM sleep, that these white bars, the REM sleep, become longer and longer as the night goes by. So there's more of it. So REM sleep happens more during the second half of the night. And the second thing that you notice is that during the first half of the night, and mostly the first third of the night, you get all of the deep sleep that you're going to get. So most of us are not really deprived of that kind of sleep, of this deep sleep, because most of us sleep at least 2-3 hours, and that's when we'll get that kind of sleep. So the best way for you to think of, I want to get good sleep, is to think, I want my sleep to be consolidated. I don't want my sleep to be too interrupted. I want to sleep solidly, not fragmented. So that's what in the morning people feel like they had good quality sleep. So quantity matters, but quality also matters. And what determines the quality is the fragmentation. But something happens with age. And what you can see in here is that if you look at the non-REM stage 3, this is in early childhood, this is age 10, it goes downhill as we get older. So most of collectively among the people in the room, including myself, we don't have too much of it. But that does not mean that we cannot sleep well. Because remember, the quality of the sleep is determined by the fragmentation. So we can still hope to not sleep in a very fragmented way. If you look at the stage 2 and the stage 1, and the stage REM, they more or less stay the same across the lifespan. If you look at stage 1 and you're thinking, so at what expense does this, we are losing something, so what gives there? Well, you get more of the lighter stages of sleep, unfortunately, but you also get a lot more wakefulness while in bed. And you can see that the time people spend in bed kind of stays more or less constant until people retire and start staying more time in bed. Right? Okay. Keep it in mind, because we'll come back to it. So when you look at what happens, what are gender differences and age differences kind of together, in this slide, that y-axis represents the percent of people in the population for this age group that report poor sleep. And what you can see is a general trend for more and more people to report they have poor sleep as we age. And you see a general trend that the blue is generally more than the green. So women report poorer sleep than men. If we study women in the lab and we study men in the lab, that does not necessarily hold true. So objectively, women do not sleep worse than men. In fact, men in some ways sleep worse than women. Yes?
Do men snore more often than women?
Men snore more often than women, but as women get older, much more often than women, but as women get older, post-menopause, the risk for snoring, the gender difference, changes. So it's still always the case that men have more apnea than women, but the margin kind of diminishes as we get older. In many ways, men and women become more alike as we get older, right? Good ways. So we know that older people sleep less overall. And the primary problem is not necessarily difficulty falling asleep. It's more commonly the ability to sleep in one chunk. So when we were young, we went to bed, we woke up, and we didn't even remember that we woke up in the middle of the night several times. Though we did. Normal sleep is associated with waking, but it's usually brief. and no big deal. That ability diminishes. So the length of the bout of sleep that you get when you're older is shorter. But it doesn't mean that you cannot roll over, wake up, roll over, go to the bathroom, come back, and fall back asleep. It is still possible to do, but it is what it is. We do not know if that fact it represents a reduction in sleep need. Some people say that older people need less sleep. We don't know if this really means that people need less sleep, or is simply they have diminished ability to get the sleep that they need. We don't know what it is. We go back and forth in the field about it. I can tell you a little bit where we are as we understand more about the science of sleep, but we don't have an answer to this very, very important question. So when is it that you just have poor sleep? It means that you have a problem. So many people have poor sleep. Poor sleep can happen when we are under stress. So occasional poor sleep, we all are familiar with that. There's nobody in the world that have never had a bad night's sleep, right? Sometimes there are mental disorders like depression and anxiety disorders. They're associated with difficulty sleeping. Sometimes physical pain or medications that we might be taking can disturb sleep. Sometimes substances such as medications or cigarettes or caffeine, as good examples, can interfere with sleep. But when is it that poor sleep becomes a disorder that you need to treat? When you bring people to the lab and you study them, and you take people who complain that they don't sleep well, and you take people who don't complain and they are considering themselves good sleepers, what you find out is that not all people who complain of poor sleep in the lab, actually their sleep looks much different from good sleepers. And quite the opposite is also interestingly true, that among people that consider themselves good sleepers, you may find people who actually don't sleep that well, but they don't consider it a problem. So that brings us to the definition of what insomnia is. Insomnia is a combination, is a disorder that is a 24-hour disorder. It is a combination of having poor sleep at night and suffering during the day as a consequence of it. Either because you're distressed about not sleeping at night, because it's really not fun not sleeping at night, so it's a matter of degree too, or because you feel that not sleeping enough or not having good enough quality of sleep has impaired your functioning during the day. So when you have a combination of both daytime and nighttime symptoms, that's when we call it insomnia, and that's when people come to us because they are distressed about it. It impacts their life, right? So here's how we think of insomnia. We all have, so think of this as the insomnia threshold. And so when you pass that threshold, you become having a problem. You start having a problem. This is the threshold. So initially, we all born with different predisposition. So some people, their sleep system is more sensitive to stress. You may have a husband and a wife and they're having an argument. And at the end of the argument, one of them may roll over and fall asleep, and the other one is sitting there and thinking and thinking and thinking, right? And so I'm not talking genders now, right? I'm just telling there's individual differences. So that is the predisposition. Then what happens is there might be in a predisposed individual a stressful event, a precipitating event, a loss of a job, a loss of a relationship, financial losses. Many things stress us and cause us to lose sleep. So then people start doing things in order to solve their problem. So some people might react by saying, of course I don't sleep, I'm stressed about this. So when I stop being stressed, I'll sleep better. And they work on trying to stop being stressed. Other people, however, not sleeping becomes so distressing to them that it almost becomes the focus of their stress. So it becomes a new stress. And now they stress about not sleeping, and they start to do a whole bunch of things to try and help themselves sleep. For example, they might do what we call casting a wide net. That is, they might not have slept well last night, therefore tomorrow they'll allow yourself extra time to catch as much sleep as they can. And that's a wonderful strategy if you have to catch a plane and you're sleep deprived and you had to curtail the amount of normal sleep. The next day, giving yourself more time to sleep is a wonderful idea. But if night after night you don't sleep well and you stretch how much you're in bed, in fact, you're making the problem worse. In fact, we can cause people who are good sleepers to have insomnia if we tell them, okay, you're sleeping 8 hours well, now I want you to do 10 hours well. They start having insomnia. Okay? Now, what happens over time, so we call these perpetuating factors, perpetuating meaning maintaining, and the reason is that after a while, some people, the predisposition remains the same, it's who I am, the stress has reduced, or we have adjusted and adjusted our life to whatever the perturbation we experienced. But then what they do in order to sleep better becomes a bigger part of the problem. And that is something that needs to be changed. And that's what I'm hoping you will take out. If you are or you know someone who got to the point in which they are no longer stressed, but they still don't sleep, that's what insomnia is, and that's what cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia does. It addresses that. Another thing that happens is, do you remember the dog, the Pavlov's dog who drooled at the sound of the bell? Well, what has happened to Pavlov's dog is that over time, because naturally you drool when you get food, you hear a bell during the time that you drool, then after a while, the bell itself with no food makes the dog drool. That's what the classical conditioning is. The same thing happens for people with insomnia. If they lay in bed night after night, they're trying to sleep, they're frustrated. Bed has become associated with tossing and turning and being frustrated. Over time, you get what we call a conditioned insomnia. What you get is you get into a spot in which you feel that you're falling asleep next to the TV, but you go to bed and zing, the mind is waking up. That is evidence that conditioned insomnia has occurred. So there's lots of evidence from science that insomnia, what underlies it, what the pathophysiology of it, is related to physiological and cognitive hyperarousal. So there is a high level of arousal for the person. I want to report about a set of interesting experiments that show that the concept is correct, seems to be valid. So there is a test that's called multiple sleep latency test that we do in the sleep lab sometimes for, say, truck drivers that we want to make sure that they are not too sleepy. So we do a test, two kinds of tests we can do. One of them is to measure their sleepiness level. And what we do is we have them sleep in the lab, and then we have them at night. Then during the day, we give them 5 20-minute opportunities every 2 hours to try and take a nap. And we measure how long does it take them to fall asleep. So the longer time it takes them to fall asleep, the more alert they are. And the less time it takes them to fall asleep on average in all of these naps, the more sleepy they are. Because if you're more sleepy, you're more likely to sleep if you're given the opportunity, right? Well, perhaps that's how we define sleepiness. However, if you take people with insomnia and you take people who are controls who don't have insomnia, and we give both of them multiple latency tests, what you find is people with insomnia actually talk longer on average to fall asleep on these naps than the people without insomnia. They sleep less, they sleep more poorly, but if you give them the opportunity for the nap, they can't sleep anyway, even if they're given the opportunity during the day. So it's different. Sleep deprivation is not the same as having insomnia. Insomnia is inherently the inability to sleep in the face of being sleep deprived and not sleeping well. There's also a model of insomnia that we can create, which is giving people caffeine. You can give people caffeine and then tell them to take these naps, and indeed, they don't fall asleep. They look like the insomniacs, only the insomniacs do it without the caffeine, usually, because they know they're not supposed to drink caffeine. Then there's a very, very nice study in which they took individuals who are insomniacs and studied them in the lab, and then they yoked, in other words, they found a pair, a matched pair, like a woman to a woman, a man to a man, same age group. And if the insomniacs took half an hour to fall asleep, then the good sleeper was brought to the lab, and the techs made sure that the good sleeper would not fall asleep for half an hour. And then the insomniac slept for 2 hours and woke up and was up for an hour. And so the good sleeper will be awakened by the technician and be kept awake. In other words, the good sleepers were made to sleep like the insomniacs sleep. So, but we wanted to look at what are the consequences of that the next day. And what you find is that people who are good sleepers, who are forced to sleep like an insomniac sleep day in and day out, during the day they are very, very sleepy. Their MSLT scores, their multiple sleep latency scores, so that average time it takes them to fall asleep, is much lower than under normal conditions. I think I'll skip the next one, so in the interest of time, but what you find out in general, what these 3 experiments that I'll talk to you about, tells us that being sleepy and tired and fatigued are not the same thing. Because people with insomnia are tired. They are tired, but they are wired. And because they are wired, they cannot sleep well. Okay? And it also tells us that being sleep deprived is not the same as not being able to sleep because of internal reasons, as opposed to being forced to not sleep or externally induced. There are also evidence from many lines of research that I'm not going to go into because we don't have time for that. Physiologically, high arousal in terms of metabolic rate, day and night, the sympathetic nervous system that is supposed to the fight or flight is much more active among people who have insomnia compared to people without insomnia. What we call the HPA axis, the stress system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is much more active among people with insomnia. And the brain activity of people with insomnia is also higher in areas that you would expect to be quiet while you were asleep and while people are asleep. And we know it from a variety of scanning of the brain, methods for scanning the brain. But also there's cognitive arousal. So this woman is telling her husband, stop thinking and you'll fall asleep, right? So basically, he's tossing and churning because his mind cannot be shut off. That's what we call a cognitive arousal, right? There's a hyperarousal. What people with insomnia oftentimes have is what we call sleep effort. How do we know what do I mean by that? If you ask somebody who sleeps well, it may be yourself, how do you do that? You don't have an answer. You don't do anything, it just happens. It happens naturally. But people who have insomnia put effort into sleeping, right? And they become what I call here pre-sleep anticipatory anxiety. Before they go to bed, when they're brushing their teeth, they also already become anxious. Will I sleep tonight or will I not sleep tonight? Should I take this medication or nothing or that medication? They also catastrophize. They are thinking, if I don't sleep tonight, then tomorrow the day will be shot, or I will look horrible, or I will not do the job that I'm supposed to be doing, or I will snap at my wife, or something like that. They also tend to have very rigid rules about sleep. If I don't sleep by such and such a time, then I won't sleep at all. And between such and such a time, I cannot do this activity, that activity, or the other to maximize the probability that I'll sleep well. They also exhibit a lot of times avoidance behavior. They'll say, I will not plan for a social activity in the evening because I don't want to get overly active. I want to make sure that I can sleep. Or because I don't think that I'll do well because I didn't sleep well the last night. So they cancel appointments during the day, or they cancel evening appointments. And they have hyperattention to threats, sleep-related threats, which I'm going to skip again in the interest of time. So let's talk about the regulation of sleep. At any given moment, the probability that you will sleep is the balance between factors that promote sleep and factors that promote alertness. Right? So that's obvious. But what are those? This is a little bit of a complicated slide, so I want you to bear with me and ask me a question if you don't understand it. So to orient you, this is day, this is night. There's a moon here. This is forces towards wake, and these are forces towards sleep. The first thing I want to talk about is what we call the sleep drive. There are two major processes involved in the regulation of sleep. One of them is the sleep drive. The sleep drive is basically, the more time that goes by since you last slept, the more, as you're awake more and more hours, your body accumulates some substances in the body, in the brain, that are actually byproducts of energy expenditure. And the more sleepy you become, the greater the sleep drive is. So it's basically, as the day goes by, you build it higher and higher. It's the force towards sleep. Remember, this is towards sleep. Okay? Now, this dark part is not necessarily night. What it is the sleep period. So when you sleep, you replenish energy, and so the sleep drive diminishes. Okay? So far, so good? Okay. Now let's go to the second force. The second force is what we call the circadian clock, a biological clock that regulates when it is good for us to sleep and when it is not. It's a system that's very sensitive to light, and it's in fact regulated by light, and it makes sure that when it is light outside, we don't sleep. Why? Because if you think at our prehistory, if the hunter and the gatherer became very, very sleepy because woke up at the crack of dawn and has been hunting and working all the time, and now is very, very sleepy because they have very high sleep drive. If he lay down to sleep, it will not be safe because the predators are out there, right? Because it's nighttime. It's not a safe thing. So there's an opposing process that actually goes towards wakefulness. Remember, wakefulness is up. And so the more time during the day, the clock is telling you, stay awake. And the more the sleep drive is high, the stronger the system says stay awake, because it has to counter that effect of the sleepiness that is building up. But that clock does not have to do with anything but actually a process that clock does not look like this red thing on the wall. It's a chemical chain reaction in the brain that takes a certain amount of time to complete. It's what we call an oscillator. Okay, and that clock, because of the time of day, will start now more quietly reducing its signal. And that point of time is an ideal time to go to sleep. Why? Because your sleep drive is extremely high, and the clock, the brain is telling you it's going to be dark, it's going to be safe, it's time to go to sleep. Okay? Then, while we sleep, as we are depleting our sleep drive, the only reason we continue to stay awake is because our clock is now much more quietly telling us to stay awake. And then at a certain point, it starts telling us, stay awake, wake up, wake up. Approximately 1 to 3 hours after that happens, we wake up naturally. So together, these two things work together, and at any point, that is how sleep is happening. This clock, the way we study it is by looking at people's core body temperature. Now, you don't want to know exactly how it's done. It's not done in a friendly manner that's clinically done. It's done only with research volunteers that are paid money for the procedures that are involved. But when the core body temperature, so you think that your core body, we are warm-blooded animals. You think, oh, we are all warm-blooded animals. We have the temperature always the same. But it's not true. There are fluctuations, approximately 1 degree Fahrenheit, of the temperature. And we studied, so the best way to think about it is as if this is our core body temperature fluctuating across the day. So the time of the minimum of our core body temperature is very important because it signals when to wake up. Okay. So what happens to the regulation of sleep as we age? First of all, the sleep drive, we know that it declines as we age. Why? Because the sleep drive, you already know it too, because I'll connect the dots for you. The sleep drive determines how much of this slow wave stage 3 sleep you'll have. And you know that it decreases with age because we've been there. We talked about that, right? Remember that? Okay. This fact and the fact that another fact about older people is that despite not sleeping as much, when we bring people, good sleepers, older adults, and good sleepers, young people, young adults, and we give them sleep, we deprive them of sleep in the lab on purpose, and then we give them battery of activities to do, vigilance tests, on the screen, and a whole bunch of tests, we find that older people are less impacted negatively by being sleep deprived than young people. So in that way, it's good, because even though you're not sleeping as well, the impact on you is not as bad. So that's good news. right? For me, at least. Uh, but you might think this might be an argument that perhaps people need less sleep, and people have put this forward as an argument that maybe older people need less sleep because fact is they can still function better if on less sleep, right? So perhaps that's the case. What happens with the clock? The circadian clock, becomes slightly advanced with age. Okay, what it means is that it shifts a little bit to an earlier time, so that the minimum and the maximum of that curve that I showed you moves to a little bit earlier time. And I'll show you a slide of that in just a minute. Another thing is that one of the things that regulates that clock, if you remember, I told you, is light. And one of the things that happens with old age is that there are changes in responsiveness of the pacemaker in the brain to light. So with the same amount of light, it has less impact on the brain. So the ability for the clock to be robust is diminished a little bit. Now, one can say that it may have to do with reduction of receptors, of light receptors, but it seems to be less of an impact of light receptors and more of the ability of the connection between the light and what the brain does with the light as we age. So think about it that way. If that's 8 p.m. and that is 10 a.m., think of a good sleeper. The T mean, which is that minimum of that clock that I told you that's coming, happens approximately, let's say, 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, some people, their whole clock is shifted in one direction or another. And aging, I told you, shifts it to an earlier time. But let's just talk about difference between people. Some people, they have a delayed phase of their sleep. Their clock is shifted to a later time. Typically, they describe themselves as night owls. That's what they call themselves. They are night people. Okay. What happens to them is that T mean, this point, is now shifted. So for a person whose clock is shifted into to a later time, to wake up at 7 and be at work at 8, it's like asking a normal sleeper, a normal phase person, to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and be at work at 5. That's how they feel, right? So that doesn't feel that good. But it also means that if that person is trying to go to bed at 11, like everybody expects them to, then their clock is still, the alerting signals are still high. They haven't started to go down yet. So they now have to work against the biology of their own biology, right? So they can't sleep, so they are still alert. So they have problem falling asleep. And then in the morning, it's extremely difficult to wake up because the signal is not screaming loud enough, wake up, wake up. So these are the phase-delayed people, or the owls. At the other extreme are people whose phase is advanced, which is what the previous slide talked about happens with older age, but it's only a slight advance. That the minimum happens much earlier. So already at 2 a.m., the minimum has occurred. So it means 1 to 3 after that, they will wake up and they will not be able to sleep anymore because the clock is going to say louder and louder, be up, so they won't be able to sleep. But in the evening, because at 8 o'clock, they all, maybe 8, maybe whatever, earlier in the evening, before 11, their clock is already, say, quieter to be awake, right? So it permits sleep to happen. So they become very sleepy, and it's hard for them to stay awake in the evening, in the early evening. And when in the morning, they cannot sleep because they wake up at 4 o'clock and that's it. It's 1 or 3 hours after their minimum and that's it. They can't sleep anymore. These are the people that we call advanced phased or larks. So it's very important to respect that and to understand how the two things have to be aligned with each other for sleep to happen right. You have to have a healthy sleep drive and you have to place the opportunity for sleep to be congruent with your clock. But not only is the clock can be shifted, it can also be weak because that signal and the variation of stay awake, higher and lower, can vary and become weaker if you have irregular sleep schedule. So if you sleep, you wake up on the weekend at noon and on weekdays at 6 o'clock, like many adolescents do, right? their clock becomes very weak. Okay, people who do shift work, particularly those who do shift work that kind of changes, that's not always the same, like night work versus day work, their clock is weak as well. And people like pilots and flight attendants, these kinds of jobs where they shift time zones frequently, also have a weaker signal from their clock. So the clock needs to be strong, and the best way to strengthen it is with regularity of schedule, particularly wake time. And it can be shifted with light. So if we want to take a person whose whole picture was shifted to a later time, and we want to shift them to an earlier time, what we do is, in the morning, we give them light. In the evening, we expect them to have darkness around as much as possible, not to be exposed to too much bright light, to dim the computer screen, to not have all of the lights in the house all around. That will push them to an earlier time. At the other extreme, if you want to achieve a delay, you have a person who is whose phase shifted to an earlier time, which happens with age. What you want to do with the light is you want to actually make sure that you get light in the evening. So go for an afternoon walk after dinner. Summertime comes, be outside. That's going to be helping because light is activating. In the morning, don't expose yourself to very bright light. So wear sunglasses if you go for a morning walk, because most morning people like to walk in the morning, and most evening people like exactly the opposite of what they need to do, but that's how it is. And so the light exposure in the evening will push the clock. The whole curve will actually physiologically push. Now, the clock is genetically determined. So that shifts that we can attain with our behaviors and with that exposures, we have to maintain these activities for them to stay there. Because if we stop doing that, it will go back to how it was. Okay? So we can behaviorally change the clock to align more with how we want to live our life, but we have to keep doing that. That's the bad news. So the third process that is important is the process of the wakefulness. So the wake and the sleep systems are not kind of an on-off switch of one to the other, but they're two systems regulated by different things, but they talk to each other. So the arousal system, the system in our body that made sure that we are awake, if you think from an evolutionary perspective, must have evolved to have the ability to trump the sleep system. Because imagine that it's nighttime, your sleep drive is very strong, your clock is just right, and you really want to sleep, but the hyenas are howling at the camp. Well, you'd better be awake, right? So it better would be the case that when there's a need for attending for danger, to perceive threats, then you'll be awake. Well, modern day threats are not hyenas. Modern day threats is I'm worrying about my child. I'm worried about my performance, etc. You get the picture, right? And so the thoughts that we have and the arousal system, we need to bring down if we are hoping to sleep. We can't drown our troubles with sleep. We have to solve our problems, or at least push them aside to make room for sleep to happen, to allow sleep to emerge. So in other words, good sleep happens if three things happen. You have strong sleep drive, you have the correct placement of the sleep opportunity, and you have a low arousal, then you have good sleep. So I'll skip that one because it's rehashing of what we said, and say just a word about cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. What it does is it targets all three aspects that we talked about. It tries to change people's behavior so that their sleep drive will increase. I'm sure that some of you can think of an example, what you would do to make sure that the sleep drive increases. All you need to do is to just think of the first slides that I presented. Right? If you nap during the day for extended periods of time, you're decreasing your sleep drive, because when you sleep, you are replenishing your energy expenditure, right? It wants to optimize the congruency between the circadian clock and when you place the opportunity for sleep. So you need to respect your clock. We have to guess what it is. It wants to make sure that the clock is strong, and for that, what's very important is to be regularly waking up at the same time. It wants to strengthen the bed as a cue for sleep, to prevent the condition, to undo the conditioned insomnia, And the way to do it is think about Pavlov's dog. How can you make the Pavlov's dog stop drooling at the sound of the bell? Yes, but the bell sounds. The bell sounds. Now, that's the easy solution. But how can you make it so that if the bell sounds, the dog will not salivate anymore? Yeah.
You don't give them the meat.
You don't give them the food. So basically, you make sure that every time you ring the bell, there's no food. But you do it consistently, because if occasionally you give them food, they relearn very quickly. So what does it mean for an insomniac who stays in bed and tosses and turns? If you can't sleep, don't be in bed, because otherwise the bed will continue to be associated with not sleeping. And we work with methods to reduce arousal of the mind and arousal of the body through learning how to deal with stress, through learning how to deal with anxiety. And the word cognitive behavioral therapy, there is a B is for the behaviors and C is for the cognitions. So we work on ways in which we can reduce sleep effort, because that's the enemy of sleep. Sleep is a process that has to be allowed to unfold. You can't force it. We work on thoughts that people have that may interfere, that may either cause arousal or interfere with sleep otherwise. And I think I'll stop at that. What does the research tell us about cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia? It's a very nice story. The story is that if you give people, if you do head-to-head comparisons of sleep medications and cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, what you get is at the end of treatment, the two groups do equally the same. But people who get cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, the effects, the benefits are longer lasting. And I'll show you in a minute a slide that shows that. The advantage of cognitive behavioral therapy over medication is that you don't need to worry about drug-drug interactions, which as we age become more of an issue. And it tends to be cost-effective, because even though it takes more money to go to a psychologist to get the sleep therapy than to take medication, you don't need to do it for too long, and then it lasts for a long time. So overall, if you look at the number of years you have to take sleep medication, the research is showing that it is cost-effective. So let me show you this picture of the difference between, in one very, very nice study. In that study, the red are the people who got CBT for insomnia. The yellow is a medication called temazepam, which belongs to a class called benzodiazepine. The blue, the light turquoise, is a combination of the two, and the white is placebo. Now, this study is about people of older age, defined as 55 and older. And they had to be coming into that particular study, they had to have had a problem in the middle of the night. They may have also had a problem falling asleep initially, but they had to have a problem staying asleep at night. They would wake up and have problem falling back asleep. And therefore, the outcome measure that I'm bringing to you in here are the minutes they were awake after they initially fell asleep. So at the beginning, at baseline, on average, people were awake in the middle of the night for an average of an hour. Some people 3 hours and some people 40 minutes, right? The first thing you want to do is to just focus at the end of treatment. And here the story is very simple. And it is that all treatments are equal and are better than placebo. That's basically the story. Now look what happens when you look to, now the study treatment are discontinued. No more insomnia therapy, no more sleep medication by the study. But people are allowed to take sleep medication if they want from their doctor. Nobody tells them not to. And then they're followed up. See what happens to the people who got the medication only. They start getting worse, and after 2 years, if you compare them, they look very much like they were at the beginning. In contrast, if you look at the people who received psychotherapy for insomnia therapy, the CBTI, they fluctuate, but at the end of 2 years, they're still much better off than they started. And that's the durability that I talked about in the previous slide. Okay? And this was all, this slide over here was all based on what people said. So they record in sleep diary how much they sleep, and we can look on subjectively how much they were awake. Interestingly, in 2006, a study came out, also published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that compared CBTI to a medication called Zopiclone. It is a precursor to what's now called Lunesta, and it was used in Europe at the same time that the medication called Ambien was used in the United States. So it's very equivalent to a more modern day common sleep medication. And the interesting point of this slide is they brought them to the lab and they saw how many minutes per the EEG were they awake in the middle of the night, as at the beginning of treatment, at the end of treatment, and after 6-month follow-up. And here the story is very interesting. Again, these were middle-aged people. Minutes awake in the middle of the night, you can see, and then they have pill placebo. So this is the pill placebo, and this is the medication, and this is the CBTI. And what you see is, objectively, people who received medication, it did not change that much how much they were awake in the middle of the night. They probably just forgot how much they were awake in the middle of the night because this medication caused amnesia. Okay? That's one explanation, potentially. In contrast, objectively, not just by what they're saying, people who received cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia improved, decreased how much they awake. They were not down to 0 on average, but they improved. And they stayed better after 6 months, after treatment was no longer there. So you can see that this is a very effective and promising treatment. The good news is it really doesn't take that much. On average, it takes us 6 sessions to help people. So what are if I had to give 5 tips of what to do if somebody has insomnia, what to do to sleep better? Don't spend too much time awake in bed. If you're awake in bed, don't be there. Okay. Establish a regular wake time that fits your circadian clock. So think of yourself, most people, by the way, are neither owls nor lark. They are neither. So most of you can probably just go by how your schedule was when you were young or how you preferred it when you were on vacations. Go to bed only when you're sleepy to maximize the probability that if you're in bed, you'll actually sleep. And stay in bed only when you're asleep. In other words, if you're not sleeping, don't be there. Don't try. Most importantly, do not try to sleep. Because trying to sleep will make it harder to sleep. And that's easier said than done. And so if you're having a hard time with that recommendation, we can help. That's where we come in. That's where the psychology comes in. And it's not talking about your childhood. It's talking about what you're doing right now. And it's relatively brief. A lot of what I've said today you can find on something that I wrote for Google, on a service that Google has that's called Null, which allows experts to write, gives them tools to write about what they're experts on. So you can write your own nulls about what you're experts on. And we've written a book that I think, Nora, we probably have a copy of it here. That's called Quiet Your Mind and Get to Sleep, which is a self-help book that you can see kind of more details and guides you through the process. So who can provide cognitive behavioral psychotherapy for insomnia? Usually it's done by psychologists or other mental health providers. Psychiatrists can do that. Master level social workers that are trained in it can do it, but they have to be specifically trained in CBT for insomnia. General psychotherapy, research shows, in itself is not effective. If somebody has depression and insomnia, which happens to be the field that I study, and you just treat the depression, even with psychotherapy, and the depression is better, the most common symptom that lingers is still the difficulty sleeping. It doesn't seem to resolve the insomnia. So insomnia needs a specialized treatment. There are people who are trained that get a certificate from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine to being certified to provide cognitive behavior. They get really long training. They know a lot about sleep. They tend to also be sleep researchers. There is a website on our society, the Society of Behavioral Sleep Medicine, that lists all the people who have certification in doing that across the nation. Okay? If the slides will be available at some point, or our medical writer can perhaps make it available for people. And I can give it to you if you don't have enough speed to write it. What do we do at Stanford? At Stanford, we have, within the Stanford Sleep Clinic, there is a program that I direct that's called the Insomnia and Behavioral Sleep Medicine Program. And we treat people of all ages, adults, adolescents, and individuals, and children. And we provide treatment either individually, or we also have a group program. And we provide services for young children, even infants that have problem in advising parents. We also provide services to help people. We've only talked today about insomnia. We haven't talked about other sleep disorders. And sleep apnea is a common sleep disorder. Its treatment is called CPAP, Cognitive Continuous Positive Air Pressure device. And it's a device that's not too easy to get adjusted to. And our service also helps people adjust to CPAP. And we now have a new service that Dr. Michelle Cow has started at the Stanford Sleep Center, which is free for people who are using CPAP, and they can learn about how to adjust to CPAP. And we also help people who are too sleepy during the day, how to manage that. And we have a website, and it's very easy to remember. It's simply called insomnia.stanford.edu. Very simple. I mean, I'm happy we got that domain. To make an appointment, here is the number. If you want specifically to be treated for insomnia, or you want to refer somebody specifically for insomnia, you have to say that you want to see a sleep psychologist, because if you just say, I have a sleep problem, you will have an extra step. You will eventually get to us, but you'll have an extra step of seeing one of the medical sleep doctors before you see us. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because they will rule out potential for other sleep disorders. You can do it either by coming to us, and we will also do the same screen and send you for a sleep study. So you can go either way. You can't go wrong. And that's it. So the question was is it true that delta sleep is the one that gives you the most regeneration? I think the reason you were told that is because growth hormone is secreted in adults only while we are sleeping, and only when we have slow wave sleep, the delta sleep. And so that's the basis for that. And that part of it is true. Because as we age, we have less delta sleep, and we have less growth hormone. We need it less.
We don't need as much.
Right. So, we don't know the answer. So the question is, what's the purpose of yawning? Does it mean that if you yawn, it means a sign that you should go to sleep? We don't know the purpose of yawning. We do know that there is a correlation, that when you are sleepy, you're more likely to be yawning. But we don't know what the function of that is. And other animals yawn as well. If those of you who have cats and dogs, you've seen them yawn, particularly cats. Yes. So the question is, can I comment on short power naps? Short power naps are wonderful. Nap got a very bad PR. Naps are not a bad thing, but making them short is very important. If you nap too long, you're depleting your sleep drive. If you keep your nap to 20 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes, it's mostly refreshing for almost all people. And if you can nap, remember, people with insomnia cannot nap, but if people can nap, it's not a bad solution. It's actually a very good solution. What you don't want is to have power naps in the evening. So the timing of when you do the power nap is also important. The ideal time for naps is between 7 to 9 hours after you woke up. Okay? So that's an ideal time for a nap, so it doesn't disturb the next night. That said, I don't care about the next night. If you're unsafe, if you're sleepy and you have to drive, take a power nap, ignore the clock, take more than a power nap. Make sure that you're safe driving, because sleepiness is red alert, as Dr. Dement says. Yes. The best time to go to sleep is around here. When your sleep drive is high and your temperature and the alerting signal decrease, or the temperature decreases. The body senses that you're on the decline. See, it senses the gradient as well. So it's not only the amount of shouting, it knows it's a promissory note, it's going down, therefore that's a good time to go to sleep. So if you were to take a power nap, should you set a clock? Yes. Or ask somebody to wake you up if you have a partner. Right. It's because you pushed through that. And to push through that, what you did is you increased your arousal, because the only way you could push through that is you increased your arousal. So now you need to come down from it before you'll feel sleepy again. I forgot to repeat the question, but I think everybody heard her from where she was, right? Okay. So there are, yes, so the question is, to clarify, why did I say that if you go into a dream right as you fall asleep, then this is a sleep disorder? Normal sleep, we don't do that. There is one disorder that is associated with falling asleep into REM sleep, and that's called narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is a sleep disorder that's relatively rare, less than 1% of the population, and it involves the excessive daytime sleepiness, so that you cannot maintain alertness. You fall asleep in the middle of conversation. You fall asleep not just with how much you slept, but you just have very, very high sleepiness. In addition, people with narcolepsy have what we call cataplexy. So when they become excited, they lose all muscle tone. And the reason is, in essence, what happens is that during REM sleep, you lose muscle tone. That is so that you will not act out your dreams. So if you're dreaming that you're hitting somebody who's attacking you, then your spouse will be safe, right? And so what happens with narcolepsy, in some ways, to think about it, is that REM bleeds into the daytime. And so there's a very high pressure for sleep, and when you go to sleep, you get directly into REM. Yes. Do we all dream? Yes, but we don't always remember our dreams. We are more likely to remember dreams that we woke up briefly after the dream, because that is an opportunity for the memory system, the wake memory system, to encode the content of the dream in a way that we can access it better when we are awake. If you dream and you did not wake up, then it somehow, if it is stored someplace, it's through a different system that we don't have access to when we are awake. It is not. And how is our circadian rhythm affected by the change of the season? Because it's an excellent question, because the seasons are characterized by different time of exposure to light. The good news is that our whole system is pretty robust. It can adjust. And the light can set it. So we can shift. We wake up at the same time. We get the light exposure in the morning, we shift. And as long as the season is like that and we continue waking there, we stay there. So we adjust to it. But the tendency to be a morning or a night doesn't change, because the tendency depends on the period of that oscillator, of that clock. How long it takes for that clock to finish a cycle. And people who are owls, it takes longer for their cycles to finish a cycle, for their circadian clock to finish a cycle. And people who are larks, it takes shorter finish a cycle. On average, we're at about 24.3 hours. Yeah, you even see it here. See this little bit of decrease here? There's a little bit of a dip. There's actually a natural dip in the clock. There are many societies that are siesta societies, and they're doing very well. They have an afternoon nap. The stores are closed. They reopen in the evening. But those societies tend to go to bed at midnight, not at 10. There's more nightlife in those societies, right? So it's a different way of being that's quite okay. Not necessarily. It depends on your life. You know, if your life is such that you want to wake up every night at 10, then maybe, and you sleep 8 hours, let's say, then just don't go to bed before 2.
But I want to do things that happen at 10 and 9. That's fine.
Okay, so if you want to set your clock,
so can I reset?
Yes, you can reset your clock, and you have to keep it there if you want to stay there. Because if you stop doing what you need to do, what do you need to do? You need to wake up at the same time every morning and have light right away when you wake up, in order to reset your clock, and go to bed only when sleepy. And so to become sleepy, you want to create something that I call a buffer zone. You want to create a period before sleep to unwind. You know, we've not evolved to kind of work on the computer, send emails, and then turn it all off and just fall asleep, you know. The cavemen, it became dark, they stopped hunting and gathering, they schmoozed around in the cave, and they fell asleep, right? It just doesn't, so you can't do that. So people like you need at least 2 hours to be doing unwinding things that are fun but not too alerting, to allow sleepiness to come, to fix your wake time, and to have light in the morning.
Keep that wake time even if I'm still going to sleep at 2, and eventually, maybe at
Yes,
some point?
yes. And but if it doesn't happen, it means that you have too much of alertness, and we can try and help you with that.
Okay.
Creative people, very creative people. You have people who are night owls tend to be most creative at night, and they don't want to stop being creative. I've had artists who are night owls. You know, you don't want to lose your identity as a night owl. It serves a purpose for you. It's when the world gives you a break and you can engage in your creative activities. It's not all bad. I mean, I think night owls got very bad rap. People call them lazy, but they're not lazy. They just have a different clock. Silicon Valley is full of very successful entrepreneurs who are night people. Don't. It's not a bad thing. It's not a bad name to be an owl. It's just what it is. It's just being an owl. It's a good bird. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, if one is troubled by pain during sleep, like arthritic pain, is it better to take pain medication during sleep, or is it damaging the sleep? The answer is yes, it is better to take pain medications to sleep. Pain disrupts sleep. And to sleep well, and not sleeping well makes you have more pain. So to break the cycle, the ambivalence about taking pain medication should not be at night. You should control your pain at night to sleep well. Don't be ambivalent about it. It's not a bad thing. It's a necessary evil, but it's necessary, so just do it. The ambivalence is making life more difficult for you than it should be. Sleep. Can I comment on exercise and how it affects sleep? So exercise, think about it. What does exercise do? First of all, it's activating, right? So if it's activating, then you need to come down from it. But it also is very effective way for many people to de-stress, right? Exercise is. But it also raises your body temperature. And so it raises your core body temperature, and in that way it could also negatively impact sleep. The rule of thumb is don't exercise 4 hours before bedtime. So don't exercise too close to bedtime. In reality, some people can exercise closer and they're doing fine. So all of these rules, it depends who the person is. If this exercise distresses you, then the good that it does is more than the evil that it does. So for different people, the balance between what it does will be different. So some people, they get more activation than relaxation, and other people the opposite, and that's ultimately the answer. But the rule of thumb and the recommendation in all the books is 4 hours, 3 to 4 hours.
Wouldn't exercise make you tired?
So the question is, wouldn't exercise make you tired?
When you're tired, you sleep more?
So research does not show.
Hard exercise.
What?
Hard exercise.
Okay, if you do hard exercise, you mean aerobic exercise, wouldn't that make you more tired? The answer is not that simple. There are people who exercise a lot, and actually when the more they exercise, when they train during very harsh training, they actually don't sleep as well. People who are sedentary, and now we are trying to make you sleep better by exercising, don't necessarily during the time that they exercise. There's not a one-to-one relationship. However, people who are active and in good shape and are regular exercisers sleep better than people who are sedentary.
Like working also, hard work.
Say that?
Hard work will do it too.
You know, your brain uses a lot of energy thinking. I mean, it actually is. It really does. So keep thinking. Yes. Okay. Okay. So you're saying, don't try to get back to sleep. Are you saying that I should get out of bed, or can I turn on the light and read? It's tricky. I don't have the same answer to everyone who asks me that question. It depends on the patient that asks me that. So let's say all your life you read in bed for about 10-15 minutes and you fell asleep, and reading actually helps you sleep. There's no harm of you, if you wake up in the middle of the night, turning on a very dim light, enough to read but not too bright, and reading for 10 minutes if it makes you fall asleep. But if you read for an hour or 2 hours or 3, then that's not the right thing for you to do. Then it is better for you to get out of bed, read there, and when you start feeling a little sleepy, go to bed, read a little bit more, and let yourself slide into sleep. Okay, and the difference is the conditioned insomnia. The difference is that you don't want to associate the bed with not sleeping. You want to make an association that bed is sleep, bed is sleep, bed is sleep. You see bed, you sleep. Your brain goes to sleep. If you are in bed doing other things, then the brain gets confused. What is bed for? It doesn't think. It just has there is an automatic process that's happening. But that's why. That's the reason why. Okay. Okay. So everybody heard the question? Can I comment about food? So in general, the rule is like exercise. You should not eat 4 hours before bedtime. Definitely not a heavy meal. And you should not eat in the middle of the night. Why is that? Why is that? It is because digestion is energizing. The body knows that food is for wakeful time. So now you're eating. So what are you telling me? That I should now be awake? Are you trying to wake me up, kind of thing? That's one reason. Another reason, the digestive system slows down when we sleep. And so if you had a heavy meal and it's not fully digested, it will take a long time for it to be digested while you sleep. The digestion itself, indigestion, can wake you up. And you have more toxins in your body for a longer time, so it's not good for your health. Research also shows that although the most important determinant of our shape, our fat or weight, is how much calories we consume relative to how much we expend, it turns out that not the timing of when we consume our calories tends to be important. And people who eat a lot of calories after 8 o'clock have harder time in diets and tend to be heavier. And so that's something to keep in mind. There are lots of laws about foods that will help you sleep. It doesn't pan out. It's the bottom line. I can tell you some anecdotes, but I want to give other people opportunities to ask questions. Okay, so the question, thank you for that question. That question was about sleep need and individual differences in sleep need. He says, what about this person who says that all his life he slept 2 hours and was functioning fine and didn't need more sleep? Is it individually? Yes, it is. So there's a bell curve distribution of how much people need to sleep. And there are people who do, there are not too many of them, but the tail end of that distribution can include some people, and you're lucky to meet one. Any more questions? Okay. Have a good evening.